Hi, peeps. Here we are again. And on a particularly powerful subject, violence in relationships, okay? Whew. You know, when I first asked a few weeks ago, or when Simone set me this challenge and set us all this challenge who are doing that program with her on business mastery, and I asked, what are some things that you'd like to talk about? What would you like me to discuss? The whole thing of violence came up several times. And, it's been ticking over. It's not that I've been avoiding it at all. It's just that it's such a huge subject, okay? I had a client at 9 o'clock this morning, and she didn't arrive till nearly 9:30. And I had a client at 10 and 11 and 12. And if someone chooses to come late, I will not transfer that time over. You've got a half an hour left, which it's that simple, because time is respect. But anyway, when this beautiful female young child woman arrived, half an hour late, she could barely walk in the door. She had left her children and had been strangled in the process, and she was broken and terrified and everything else. So I had half an hour left with her, okay? And so in that half hour, I calmed down the emotional system. I gave her some emergency drops and instructed her to take them every 15 minutes. And then at the end of the session, in the end of that half hour, I took her upstairs and made her a cup of chamomile and honey tea. And I said, "You're not leaving anywhere." See, this tribe member was someone that we knew and that I know on the periphery of my family, And I said, "No, honey, you're not going anywhere." And she was a mess. She was calmer, but still a mess. And then the next 3 clients, boom, 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 boom. All women, all who were coming to deal with the consequences of violence. And, by the end of the morning, I'm feeling a little pissed off with this. And it had me reflect about how many percentage of my clients that I deal with on a daily basis are a consequence of trying to come to terms with the violence inflicted against them. And when I actually thought about it, I'm looking at 50, 60, maybe 70%. It's a huge subject, which is part of the reason I was needing to give some time to myself. But the fact of the matter is, it's an endemic and growing problem, and nothing is done about it. Nothing. I mean, throwing a few million here to build a few shelters for women running away is pathetic. It's the same drivel as throwing a few $1 million at how do we deal with the homelessness, okay? Jesus. It's not doing anything. Do you know that the laws that were enacted to deal with violence in relationships, it's not that they were created to deal with violence in relationships, but when the laws that were enacted that help us, that constrain us in dealing with taking care of people being treated violently, were enacted over 100 or so years ago. The actual literal thing in some of those laws describes women and children and lunatics, that's their word, not mine, in the same breath of incompetence. Lunatics, women and children, they're all fucked. So let's not give them anything, but, we've got to deal with them, bloody neurotic cows and whatever. So this is the legal system that we are dealing with the remnants of. And when laws are enacted, it's very easy to enact them. A bit like what we're watching in the terror laws being enacted at the moment. Very easy to put them in place. No one removes them. No one removes them. And when these laws governing the protection of women and children were written, it literally says in some of those laws that lunatics, women and children are incompetent and we shouldn't give them too much attention. I kid you not. Literally, do a bit of research, it's there. I did a 5-year stint in child and adolescent psychiatry back in the day. One of the most horrifying 5-year stints I ever did in psychiatry. And it taught me that the law is an ass and that truth and justice have nothing to do with each other. I mean, seriously, look at the Catholic Church. Look at this Pell crap. The dirty little kiddly fiddler is going to appeal again and someone else is going to pay for it, some Catholic cow-tugging bloody twit who hands their money over at the plate every Sunday, and the lawyers. You know, we are living in a toxic patriarchy and a toxic capitalistic state created by it. Children who are made wards of the state care. And don't, seriously, Lovey, I don't know if you people are aware of the Jeffrey Epstein case about the exposure that is coming. I spoke of this back in March, that there would be a great exposure of the elite pedophile ring that is operating globally, child sex trafficking. The Jeffrey Epstein case, you know, the one that committed suicide recently, is just the beginning of that. We haven't seen anything yet, I promise you. There's no hiding it anymore. And remember what I always said. Each time you see it exposed, it's because the light has come in, okay? The system is broken profoundly. And then when you look at the laws around family law and, you know, what's done to men who are screwed over forever and what's done for women who cannot protect their children against the violent perpetrator because the law says the system is profoundly broken. How did we end up in such a place? How do we personally end up with violence? And let me say right now from the outset, because this matters, I'm not completely, you know, I too have experienced violence. I lived for 5 years with a violent psychopath who beat me up on a regular basis. Thank God he's not genetically connected to my children. They came earlier. But I know what I'm talking about. And then, you know, he was part of the reason I went into this field of endeavor to try and understand how this goes on. How is it perpetuated? How does it happen? There are deep-seated complexes in all of us, within all of us. If we are raised in environments where we are given no worth, no value, if we are ignored, if we get the messages of don't be you or worse, don't exist, okay? It becomes a belief that we occupy about ourselves. And once we occupy this belief about ourselves, our belief creates the reality and we will draw it in. Remember, we've talked over the last few nights about when you have this belief, when you have this propensity to think you have no value, the universe will give you the constant reminders until you learn to work it out that it is the lie. And even when we work it out that it is the lie, everything in the system is stacked against us. Everything in the system, from law, from social work, from whatever, it all says, it's not that bad, you know. There is an inherent power discrepancy in the toxic patriarchy that we live within. And in that inherent power discrepancy, guess who wins? It's certainly not the women. So when a woman has this, or a man even, it's rarer for men, but it still happens. When this system has been built in our own heads and hearts that we have no worth and no value, and we start drawing in the mirror of that, the reality of that, which is trying to teach us that it's not true. Seriously, that, we're not being punished for thinking like that. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, will give us as much pain as we need until we snap out of it. It's that simple. But once we're in it and we draw these creepy little fuckers in, and yes, pardon my French tonight, I'm a bit over this, because not only did I deal with this client this morning, but every client that came after it, every single one of them, was either dealing with the financial abuse, the long-term consequences of child sexual abuse. Seriously, every client I dealt with this morning was dealing with the consequences of violence. And then I sat back over lunch while I'm running around doing other things, and I thought about, I would reckon about 60 to 70% of everyone I'm working with is dealing with the consequences of this. And once you've taken on board that you have no worth and no value, and you're bringing these assholes in, and they come, and then, you're being violently treated, but you have no worth and no value, so somehow it's your fault, and somehow you're guilty, and somehow you're responsible. And you've got this narcissistic arsehole, or this frightened boy child, and they're gaslighting you all the time. I didn't do that. I never said that. It's your fault. It's your fault. What? And if they're not doing that, once they've struck you, they're filled with remorse. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'll never do it again. My heart is breaking. I love you, love you, love you. I promise I'll never do it again. And in the meantime, financial screws are being tightened down. Emotional gaslighting is going on. Psychological gaslighting is going on until finally the first blow comes. But that comes later, when they've got you. And the woman in that moment absorbs the blame. Yes, it's my fault, mea culpa. They start to doubt their own sanity. They start to doubt everything, and they feel guilty and ashamed and embarrassed, and they can't share it with their family, and they can't share it with their friends because it's all my fault. Now listen to me, and listen to me well. Not all men are violent. Most are equally ashamed and appalled by what goes on. I have 2 sons. I have 2 brothers. I have nephews. And I know absolutely, and trust me, it's my job to know the psyche. I know absolutely that they would no more strike a human being than fly to the moon. And this morning, when this lady, this abused creature, came into my household, and I took her upstairs and gave her a couple of chamomile tea while I dealt with more abuse consequences. My youngest son came home with his partner. We were having an engagement party this weekend, which is fabulous. And I was very proud of my youngest son. When the woman who was being abused, and who was a fragile, crying mess, even after cups of tea and drops and what have you, and we're saying to her, doctor, police, now, AVO, this stops now. And she's going in the way that she's conditioned to go. Oh, but what's going to happen to the children? Oh, he's trying hard. It's going to mean the loss of his job, blah, blah, blah. And my son stood up and said, no. Violence is violence, and there is no excuse. Nothing. And my son and his partner have been working all day to bring this child and her children to safety. Violence is never okay. Now understand this, and I want you to understand that there are women in life that do this. And I have witnessed this over many years. There are women who, through their own complex neurotic needs, will push and provoke and irritate and alienate and condemn. And women tend to be more articulate than men, and they push until that poor fucking man is overwhelmed with the relentlessness of this poison, until eventually they strike out And this can be in same-sex relationships as much as it can be in heterosexual relationships. And then the minute that poor partner strikes out under the relentless persecution of vicious bullshit, then that person gets to be the victim. Oh, look at what they've done to me, for whatever reason is going on in her reality. Does that make the violence okay? No. No. But nor is the provocation to violence okay, nor is the cuntox acts of nasty people doing nasty things, pushing things to the edge just because they can, just because they're cleverer, so that they can feel a victim, okay? And you want to add drugs and alcohol into that, and you're watching a disaster waiting to happen. And I implore all people who are being pushed like that, before you explode, walk out of the house. Just fucking walk out. You're dealing with a monster. Get out. Get out before you react, okay? Now, I'm 66 years of age, my darlings, even though I look lovingly younger. And I've been working in this field for 35 odd years of psychiatry, mental health, shamanism, transpersonal counseling, blah, blah, blah. Some of them have been very odd. And there's not too much that I haven't seen about how vile the human complexity of neurosis can get. So please understand, you know, there are no victims, there are no innocents. However, violence is never, ever okay. Never. If you're getting overwhelmed with something, fuck off. Get out of the house. And for the precious babies who are dealing with a narcissistic, psychopathic cunt, understand it is not your fault. And please understand, I'll be quite honest here. Again, I will say, I have lived with this. I have personally had a psychopath in my house that beat me up, that tormented my children. I am eternally grateful that he is not part of the genetic link of my tribe. He is not the father to my children. Thank God. But why does this silence of violence occur? You know, back in, I think it was around 2007, Simone, my beloved, gorgeous, powerful daughter, she came up with a project that we were dealing with in Thrive by Design, and she called it, and we all, you know, I backed her up 100%. Project Daylight it was called. And what it was designed to do was that when you saw someone in the supermarket shouting at their child, when you saw someone in the pub harassing their partner, whatever, that you would step forward and speak about it. You would step forward to that woman in the supermarket, not to make her wrong, but to just say, do you need some help? Can I carry your groceries to the car? But you might in the pub say, actually, would you mind shutting up? This is not okay. What was fascinating about this, and we did a lot of energy into this, and it fell on its face. It fell on its face. It just didn't happen. And this is back in around 2007. I think the momentum for change is growing, by the way. And there were many things that came out of that. You know, I was running conscious parenting programs at the time where, you know, how do we not hand down that shit to ourselves, to our children, that was done to us, to our children? And there was one of the young mums in one of the conscious parenting programs that was pregnant with her second child, and she's in the middle of all this Project Daylight and speaking up thing. And she's at a hospital waiting room at Flinders Medical Centre. And while she's there with about 10 other pregnant women waiting to be seen by the system, there was one particular thug in the room who had a 3-year-old child with him as well as his pregnant wife or whatever. And for about 20 minutes, this child is trying to look at a book, play with a toy, and everything he touched, the father's saying, don't. And this poor little fucking kid is just going, setting the tone for future violence, my loves. Until the woman who was in the class with us couldn't stand it anymore because she's very consciously aware of it. And the last thing that this creep said to his child was, don't fucking arc up to me or I'll take you outside and give you something to cry about. And this woman just exploded with all these people around her. And she said, well, how about I call the security and get them to give you something to cry about? And instantly, in that moment, all those people who had been very passively quiet stood up and said, yeah, shut up, stop it, you're being terrible, blah, blah, blah. It took her to initiate, but everyone was feeling the same thing. And eventually the security guards were called and he was taken outside, blah, blah, blah. Who gives a shit? About a week after that, I was rung by a journalist in Sydney who eventually did a piece on Project Daylight in some magazine, I can't remember. And, we talked about it at length, what it was about, blah, 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 blah. A week later, she rang me. And she'd written the piece, and it was all very lovely. But she rang me about a week later, and she said she was living in an apartment building in Sydney, about 4 or 5 levels. And she heard across the wall from her a woman screaming, crying, saying, don't, stop. And she left her room because of Project Daylight, and she went to knock on the door, and she heard the man's loud voice saying, shut up, bitch. And she couldn't. She went back into her room, and she had to ring me and say, oh my God, it's exactly like you said. I was paralyzed with terror. I could not do anything. When we witness violence, when we witness the expression of violence, when we see the black eye on our friend, when we see a child being yelled at the street, what happens to us is that we are immediately transported back to a time in our childhood when someone was monstering us, and all children are monstered. It's how they keep the system rolling on. It's how inadequate, frightened people continue to stay in control and power of more inadequate and frightened people. And she was overwhelmed by this. It blew her away. Oh my God, it's true. She was frozen in fear because it had awakened in her a time when someone was being violent with her, and she just went, oh my God, I can't. And part of it is the Stockholm factor. And I talked to you about this the other night, guys, where I said, one of the interesting things when the aeroplane hijacking thing was going on a lot in the 70s, there was a particular plane that was kidnapped, ended up in Stockholm, blah, blah, blah. They eventually rescued the passengers 3 days later after killing a few people. And when the passengers came out, what struck the bloody people looking after them was how they were all defending the hijackers. And this is what goes on in families. When one child is being traumatized, when mum is being traumatized, what happens is that everyone else goes, oh my fucking God, that is so scary. What do I have to do? I have to be like the abuser, because if I'm like him, he won't pick on me. He'll pick on them, but that's better than him picking on me, right? As Hannah Arendt says in her great treatise on the banality of evil that was written after the Nazi Holocaust, evil things, bad things happen when good people sit by and do nothing. They stay silent. Why do they stay silent? Because every time they witness violence, it reminds them of when they were 2-year-old and dad was yelling or drunk or whatever fucking stupid thing was going on. And it's an emotional reaction, and it shuts them down. They either dissociate or freeze. And that's why this bullshit goes on forever. Many years ago, oh, my life is a weird and wondrous thing. But many years ago, one of my dearest friends used to channel as in bring in a very large, powerful entity. in a way that he didn't like. I fucking loved. It was the greatest gift I had in a long time, but it frightened him, beside the point. I remember sitting at a channeling with this divine being, and he was talking to an adult man about 35 years of age who'd been beaten up every day of his life. And when he wasn't being beaten up, his mother was being beaten up, etc. We all know the stories. We all know the circumstances. And this channeled entity said to this man, can you imagine any circumstance in your life that would have you strike a child? And this man could not imagine anything that would drive him to do that. And the wise channeled entity said, if you can't imagine what that fear is like that would have you behave so appallingly to another human being, if you can't even imagine that, then imagine what it is like for someone who is bound in that fear enough to do that. Think about that. This is not about making excuses, beloved friends, for there is no excuse for violence. It's just helping you to understand where it comes from. How do we change it? How do we change it? It is time in this world that we all step up. Let's make Simone's baby, Project Daylight, a reality. When we see it, act. Support the person on the receiving end of that violence. Help them find solutions. Safety first is the first priority. If you see anyone being violently treated, their safety, the safety of their children, is paramount. And understand this, not all people treated violently in childhood will behave violently. Not all of them hand it on. We all have choices. Not all pedophile child abusers, people who were abused in childhood, go on to abuse children. They don't. Some say no. You know, about a decade, probably longer, I'm getting older now. But there was a time I was working in a private psychiatric clinic. And once or twice a year, a young man in his 30s would come in. He'd been sexually abused as a child by a priest. And he was tormented. And back in those days, they didn't have the skill set they needed to heal it. But he would occasionally get urges where he would want to grasp a child. And that young man would bring himself into hospital. He would voluntarily admit himself until the urge passed. He'd take medication, he'd do whatever it took. And you know what fucking pissed me off at that time is that all the nurses and others around him would go, oh, what a terrible creature. No, what a brave and powerful man that was, that when he felt those urges, he chose not to act on them. He chose to come in and get help to deal with them. Okay? Stop looking down your nose at people who seek help. The thing is, when we see violence, challenge it. What we know about violence is that when someone steps up into the environment and says no, it stops. It's a bit like when you train a child to say no to sexual abuse. When you teach them to say no to the adult in the room, the adult will go away and find a softer target. It's that simple. So when you see things going on that don't feel right to you, speak to them, stand up, say no. Don't disparage men or women struggling to walk out of these violent situations. There, but for the grace of God, go any one of us, okay? And remember what I said about we've all got these complex things within us, be they karmic, be they genetic, whatever. Be they environmental. If we've been raised in a way where we think we have no worth, we will draw it in. It doesn't make us bad. It doesn't make us our responsibility. It just means we're trying to learn a lesson and let it go. And by the way, there's another case of violence I want to talk to you about. If you see someone in a methamphetamine rage, okay, and there's a lot of methamphetamine bullshit going on now. That is not something you reason with. That is not something you attempt to negotiate with. If you see anyone or you know someone who's doing meth and they're starting to get angry, run. These things are not human when they enter that meth rage, and they will kill you soon as look at you. Run. Don't ever even try and deal with that shit. The world is disassembling, darling. And it needs to disassemble. Look around you at this toxic patriarchy, this toxic fucking capitalism. It's a required disassembling if humanity is ever going to grow. This is the boil that needs to be lanced, okay? It does. And we must all play a role now. All of us. Yes, we are all afraid of it. When we witness violence around us, we have a tendency to freeze as though we were 2-year-old and someone was yelling at us, okay? I understand absolutely. You must all understand why you say nothing. But it is no longer acceptable to sit on the fence. This world needs changing. Humanity needs changing. The great feminine is rising, and it's terrifying everybody. Men in particular, because as it arises in them and they've got no capacity to deal with it, they just lash out at women around them. Women, as it rises in us, we have been trained to be so passive and accepting, we're terrified of it too. Enough. It is no longer acceptable to sit on the fence. It is no longer acceptable to listen to social workers, healers, or any other twat that wants to tell you somehow it's your fault. Should you try this? Should you be nicer here? Should you pretend that? Should you read? No! Violence is never acceptable. Stop listening to any garbage that justifies it, explains it, or says that in somehow it's your fault. I agree we are all complicit in the pain of relationship, but violence is never acceptable. It is no longer acceptable to pretend that this isn't the crisis that it is. We are not all responsible for violence, but it is all of our responsibility to change it. It is all of our responsibility to not sit in judgment of it or the people involved in it. It is all of our responsibility to not think that we are better than anyone involved in it. It is all of our responsibility to stand in the shoes of the other and feel compassion for all parties in it. And remember what I was saying the other day? When you witness these things, blessings upon the perpetrator of violence, blessings upon the receiver of violence, and blessings upon everyone that witnesses it, and then stand up and say, no more. We are living in a busy world that is set up for us to pretend that this is not happening. It is all of our responsibility to take time to stop when we see it and to support and help whoever's on the receiving end of it. It is all of our responsibility to challenge the crap of the perpetrator, and they're really fucking good at it, by the way. I'm talking about narcissistic, psychopathic fuckwits. Sorry to be swearing so much, but I'm over the bastards, okay? I get they've got their own world of pain. Remember what the channeled entity said? Can you imagine the pain that would drive you to do that? No, and I'm grateful I can't get into the headspace that would provide that violence. Doesn't mean we can't have compassion. Nor does it mean we can't say no. It's time to start agitating your local parliamentarians. What the hell are you doing about this slaughter of 1.6 women every week? You know, a man gets king hit and dies, the whole fucking country loses its tiny mind, and we've got all these lockout laws and blah, blah, blah this and blah, blah, blah that. But 1.6 women die every week. Who gives a fuck? I am so over that. It is all of our responsibility to not turn our back on the black eye and the story of, oh, I walked into a door. That poor blessed child feeling so bad and so guilty and so ashamed because everything that goes wrong is the woman's responsibility. Say, no, I don't believe your story of the door. Ask, how can I help? But don't ask how you can help with judgment or condescension. Ask how you can help with love. It is all of our responsibility to understand, but there, for the grace of God, were I raised that way, I could be in that same situation. How dare you judge it? And women are particularly good at judging women. There, but for the grace of God, go I. And I get, my beloved humans, that there is a much bigger spiritual perspective in this illusionary 3D world that we dwell in. I get that. We're all profoundly kind of responsible for ourselves. That is a story for another day. But to say no, to say that to a woman, in the midst of that pain, to say that to a man in the midst of that terror that requires that violence, or to say that to a child who is witnessing it and has no power whatsoever in this 3D illusion that we have come to experience, that somehow this is your creation or co-creation, in a moment of terror or pain, is just fucking more cowardice and the banality of evil. And any fucking social worker or healer that says that shit needs a slap up the side of the head with a lump of 4B2. Violence is wrong. Pure and simple. I don't give a shit who you are, where you've come from, what's shaped you, what's molded you, what neurotic complexes you've got, what karma, what genetic, whatever. All of those things are valid, but the moment you strike another human being, out the window. No. No more. Seriously. I cannot stress it enough. And I am done with this shit. You know, 70% of the people I see are dealing with this crap or the consequences of it. And then that narcissistic fuckwit who goes around to all his friends recruiting ally, or all of her friends recruiting allies. And women are just as guilty of this. Same sex, other sex, powerful creatures. You know, women can be assholes too. But violence is wrong. And violence, it's not just the blow. That's the final act. The gaslighting, the emotional put-downs, the psychological torment that leads to that first. So that by the time the blow is delivered, the person on the receiving end of that blow is feeling ashamed and guilty. I am done with that fucking shit. And 4 times today I witnessed this. 4 times. 1 acute, 3 long-term. We must all stand up. We must all become aware. We must witness our own terror of violence. We must all watch and be on the alert. And when we see a woman with a black eye, don't accept the story of the door. When we see a child being tormented in the supermarket, can I help you? And if I can't help you, bitch, shut the fuck up and leave the kid alone, or I'll report you. Seriously. No more. I'm tired of the knuckle-dragging thugs of reality terrorizing good people in this life. I'm really over it. I want a Project Daylight that my daughter inspired 10 years ago to rise up now, for us all to take responsibility for what we witness in the world and say no. You know, when I was talking the other night about saying no to the market, this is no different. For God's sake, we must, fuck God, there is no God. For spiritual sake, for our own divinity's sake, we must rise up and say, enough. We must challenge it every single time we see it. And we must agitate for change, for powerful change. The great feminine is rising. She will not be denied. She will, you're about to witness climate, famine, everything that's coming. That's her returning after the 26,000 Yuga, remember. She's not particularly happy with what we've done in her absence. But in the meantime, it behooves all of us to say enough to violence. No more. No excuses. No nothing. Hello, darling. Yes, you can come and say goodnight. My grandchildren have come to say goodnight. So I will finish this here and now. Hello, Emmy. I'm just having a little rant on video, okay? Good night, sweetie. Sleep well. So thank you for listening to me. And this has been bugging me all day. And you know, when my first beautiful lady came in this morning, crippled, broken, and even when she left several hours later going, oh my God, I can't upset him. Oh my God, it's not his fault. Oh my God, he'll lose his job. Oh my God, he tries. Jesus wept. I am tired of the manipulation of the psyche of all things feminine in men and women. All right, I'll let that go. Please, darlings, please, you beautiful humans, please, enough. Don't endure it. Don't make excuses for it. Don't pretend you don't see it. Don't condemn the people on the receiving end of it. Don't. Because there, for the grace of God, go any of us. And we've all been there, in some form or other, if not in this life, in many others. Let us together join hands with all and say enough, enough. Thank you for listening to me. This is such a potent subject. And it is so at the floor of what is so wrong with the world in the toxic patriarchy and the toxic capitalism that comes from it. Women are at the bottom end of that. Remember, lunatics and children? So we are the ones that tend to express it. But we are also the ones that have found a way through it by the sisterhood, by the navigation. Men have none of that. And yet they're equally disempowered. Men can be abused too. Remember, can you imagine the pain that would have you strike someone? No? Then imagine how awful that pain must be. Yes, we must stop it, but have compassion for all involved. Let us do what we can to heal rather than condemn. I'll talk more on this. My heart is breaking now. Thank you very much for listening to me. It matters. You matter. Love you all, sweeties. Thank you.